Hello students, in this lesson we're going to go over a few simple endgames that we really need to understand before we dedicate more time to openings and middle games. So take a look at this position, and all I need you to do is pause the video and tell me if you think it's safe for my pawn to go all the way to the end and become a queen before my opponent's king can get me. So take your time and let me know what you think. Well, there are two methods to help you make this decision. One is going to take you long, and the other one could take you only a few seconds if you know how to do it right. And the first one is pretty straightforward. You just calculate. Just imagine the pawn going up, and then imagine the king moving towards it, and see if it works. Like if I'm going here, then the king could go one step, the pawn goes another step, and then you do that in your head and see if the pawn gets before the king. To some people this is going to be confusing, to some it's not, but one thing is for sure, it's going to take you a lot of time. So here we have to use what we call the rule of the square, and what we're going to do is we're going to imagine the pawn going to the first square, and I'm going to do it just to make it easier for you to understand this time. So I know my pawn is going to jump here, and at this point he's going to have his own square. And how do we get that square? Well, you draw a diagonal line all the way to the end of the board, and that's going to give you your square. So I imagine that line going back to the rank to where my pawn is, and that helps me draw a square. Now this is going to be your square, this is going to be your box, and the key is that if this king is able to make it in the box when he makes his next move, then he's going to get the pawn. If he doesn't, then he's not going to get the pawn. As simple as that. So at this point, he's not going to make it. So you're going to see how when I move the pawn again, that box keeps shrinking. So now it's smaller, and every time the king moves, he's never going to be able to make it in the box. So now the box is going to be this small. The king goes here. Now look, only 4 squares, and the king cannot get to the pawn. And just like that, I got my queen on time, and now we know how to do the queen and king checkmate. So this is the concept of the box. But just to go over it one more time, let's say that this person forgets that the pawn could go 2 steps, and he just goes 1 step. If we do the box one more time, so this is going to be my box. Notice how the king in one move gets in the box. And that's going to tell us, well, he's going to get to the pawn. So if I keep pushing, he's getting in the box every single time, and he gets my pawn. So in a case like this, the best choice was to just bring my own king and help. But now I hope you guys understand the concept of the box, because trust me, you're going to be using it a lot. So I'm going to give you a few examples, and we can do this together. Here we go. It's my turn. I'm the white pieces. Should I send the pawn or not? So I imagine the pawn going here, and from there I draw my box. Is the black king gonna get in the box? Well, if my pawn is here, my box is going to be this big. Can the king get in there in one move? No, he can only go here or here, and both squares are outside of the box. So that tells me I push, he's not even gonna get me, and I got my queen. So here's my turn. I'm going to c4, and my square is going to be this big. So once I go to c4, can my opponent's king get in the box in one move? Well, yeah, he could in one move get in the box, and that tells me he's going to get me. So if we test it out, c4, he keeps going diagonally, and look, he got to me on time. So I get my queen, and he's gonna get me. Next one, what do you think? Well, here I imagine my pawn going to e6, and from there I draw my box, and guess what? The king could get in it in just one move. So it's not safe to push the pawn. I'm going to have to bring my king to help him along the way. So pushing it by himself, not a good idea. He's going to get me. And there we go. So here it is, guys. By now you should have a better understanding of the rule of the square, and I hope that you use it more when you get to pawn endgames. Now, with that out of the way, let me just go over one last concept here. And if I bring you back to this position, I'm going to put the pawn on b2. I wanted to tell you the name that we assign to a pawn like this. So this is what we call a passed pawn. A passed pawn by definition is a pawn that cannot be stopped by any of his opponent's pawns. So notice that if I push this pawn, he cannot be captured or blocked by any of my opponent's pawns. And if instead my opponent had a pawn right here, then this is not a pass pawn anymore, because the moment I get to b6, I'm going to be captured. The same thing if this pawn happens to be on b7. This is not a pass pawn, because the moment I get to b6, I'm going to be stopped. So this is not a pass pawn. A pass pawn is a pawn that cannot be stopped or taken by another pawn. And it's really important that you understand this, because pass pawns are really, really good to have, especially when it comes to endgames. Because guess what? They could go all the way to the end and get you a queen. So now that you know what a pass pawn is, I want you to look at this position and tell me if you can see a pass pawn for whites or for blacks or for both. Well, if you pause the video, your answer should have been only one pass pawn is available for the white pieces. If you look at the black piece's pawn, this pawn is not passed. I have this pawn that could block him, I have this pawn that could take him. This pawn, well, same thing. This one could block him, this one could take him. This pawn is not a pass pawn because he could be captured by my pawn. But then the white pieces, none of these pawns are pass pawns, but look at this one. This one is going to be a pass pawn because there's no pawn that could ever stop him from getting to the end. So that means the king has to do the hard work. And as you know, if we use the rule of the square, that king would never get to me on time. So I imagine my pawn going to a4, I do my square, and guess what? The king is not close by. So I'm just going to push, and thanks to my pass pawn, I will be able to win this game. Because if, let's say, he tries to run to get to my pawn, I'm just going to get my queen. And before I told you, you could use your queen to do the queen and king checkmate, but in this case, he has all the pawns. So maybe you want to go after his pawns first. So let's say he moves, I don't know, here. I go after his pawns first to take him, and then I do the queen and king checkmate. So that's why I wanted to go over pass pawns, because this is a concept that you really have to understand. Pass pawns, the rule of the square, before we move on to openings and endgame. Now there's something quickly that I wanted to do with you, and it's nothing complex, nothing to do with the rule of the square. It's just an exercise you're going to benefit a lot from it. So I want to show you this position where I have my pass pawn, but this time the king is right in front of him. He's ready to stop me from promoting my pawn, but guess what? I also have a minor piece. We know king and bishop are not enough to do checkmate, but I have a pawn. So let's say here's the black pieces to move, and they get in front of my pawn to block me. Well, we really have to use here the help of the bishop to get that king out of the way. So he's doing a blockade. We have a dark square bishop, so he's going to be used to do check. The king moves, and now we could either push the pawn or we could bring the king to help us out. So in this case, just to practice, I'm going to push the pawn. He's protected by the bishop, and then when the king gets out of the way, I wish I could promote, but guess what? The pawn has no protection. So guess who's going to help? The king. And this is something very important that you're going to notice from now on. Anytime we get to an endgame, your king is going to be a very important piece. So at this point, my king wants to help the pawn, so he needs to be right here. So I'm going to go king f6. This king gets in the way. Now, can I go to f7? Well, I can't, because the king is there and they cannot be next to each other. But all I need to do is do a move with the bishop. My pawn cannot move. My king is waiting to get in front of him. So I just do a move with the bishop. Now this king has only one way out, which is here. And when he goes to d7, then my king goes in there. Now anywhere the king goes, I'm going to promote my pawn and I get a queen. The last one is going to be the same thing, but we're going to have a knight instead. So let me put the knight here. And let's say it's the same thing, the black pieces move right here. And look at this, I'm going to just in one move, I'm able to attack the king and put him in check. Even if I couldn't do it in one move, let's say my knight was here, I would find a way to get to control this square. That's it. So he's in check, he needs to move. And now, again, I could bring my king closer to help, or I could just push. And it's the same thing. If the king comes out, well, I go the other way, and I just need to control this square. So I could do that. Or, look at this. Before, the bishop was not able to control both dark and light squares. But guess what? The knight could do it. So I could just use my knight and attack that king. Don't forget, if I move my king, let's say here, it's going to be stalemate. So I have to be very careful here. And again, I could use the knight to just do this. Check. He's hitting the king needs to get away from the blockade. And now the knight is going to be supporting my queen once I get it. So I get my queen, check, and she's defended by the knight. Now when the king moves, you know how to finish this. You don't even need the knight. You know how to do the queen and king checkmate. So let me go back and let me show you the other way I could have handled this. I could have just moved my king because the knight is still defending the pawn. When the king moves, then I go in. And then he's going to support the pawn to get to the end. All right, guys, so now this is actually the end. And this is a class that you really want to go over a few times if you need to, and make sure that you understand these ideas. So next class, we will be talking about openings. So I will see you then.